Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming this evening to the Sandwich Glass Museum and Historical Society. This is one of our talks in a series of talks given by our guest artists. Tonight we'll hear from 5 artists. They are based throughout New England. We have 2 exhibitions today opening, Creatures Great and Small, and the work is by Mariel Bass, Claire Kelly, Jennifer Violette, and Caterina Weintraub. We also have the exhibition Flyover by Salem artist Aron Leaman. After the talks, please feel free to go into the exhibit and speak with everyone. Jen Violet is also part of the Creatures Great and Small. I apologize, Jen, but she's a very important part of the exhibition. We have some wonderful guests here who are also artists, 2 board members, Michelle Tramble and David McDermott. We're very grateful for all our board members for their support and all the members of the museum. If you haven't thought about being a member, please consider it. We offer talks like this. We are also beginning other programming which will be offered specially to members. There won't be a question and answer here after the talks. Each artist will speak about 10 minutes, but then you will be able to go into the galleries and speak with them then.
All right, so my name is Mariel Bass. Welcome to the Sandwich Glass Museum, and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my artwork and also myself. Okay. I grew up in a small town outside of Keene in New Hampshire. And as a kid, I always loved playing outdoors. I loved making art, and I also really loved the animals that I would encounter outdoors. Okay. When I graduated high school, I knew I wanted to do something art-related, but I wasn't sure what, so I decided to go to Massachusetts College of Art in Boston, where as a freshman, I actually got lost in the school.
Sorry.
Yeah, and ended up in the glass department where I saw some of the most amazing student work, and then also to see glass being made live. I was like, I'm going to stay here. This is my spot, and I just kind of never left. So on the right there, that's me with some of my graduating class. There's a few people missing, but on the upper right is my most favorite teacher, Susan Holland. She's an amazing artist, and you should check her out. Okay. I learned more in college than just about glass. I learned something about myself, which is that I am not particularly a city person. So by the time those 4 years were over, I was very ready to live someplace more remote. So I chose to move 3,000 miles away to a teeny tiny island in the Caribbean called St. John. Okay. In St. John, I worked at an eco-resort, and as a staff member there, I lived in above-ground tent cottage, which you can see partially hiding behind that cactus there. And it was a really amazing experience getting to kind of live outside and obviously to see this view every morning. Okay. The other main attraction for me is that there was a hot shop there, and I just graduated with a glass degree. It was not a very large or fancy hot shop. In fact, it did not even have walls, but it was enough to get me started. Okay. We mostly did small-scale production, like on the left here. That's kind of a normal day of production for me. But the other interesting thing about this studio is that it was all recycled glass. So on the right there, it's kind of meshing into the wall, but you can see there's a bunch of bottled glass. And so every morning we would process that for a couple hours, break all the bottles, and then remelt them into our furnace. The concept being that people could take home the trash that they made as a treasure. Okay. I quickly found ways to kind of complicate these small and simple production items. There was some opportunities to make longer pieces in the evening when we would do demonstrations as entertainment for the guests. So I started to make more involved things like the one on the left. And then after a couple of years, we had a great art director, and she managed to get us some cold working equipment. And so then I started to incorporate imagery into my three-dimensional glass pieces, like the one on the right. I've always been super drawn to complex patterns. After about 5 years, the resort sadly had to close, so I got myself another job all the way over in St. Petersburg, Florida. Part of my job was doing demonstrations there. We would do production for the owner during the day, and we would talk to large school groups about what we were doing while we did it. The other part of my job was fabricating studio equipment, which turned out to be a really valuable skill for me, learning how to weld, something that was useful in my own work, and also just maintaining the studio equipment. This is me changing out the crucible by myself in August. The more glamorous aspect of this job was that I got to assist and get to know some really great artists that I formerly had only just seen photographs of their work. So it was kind of a wild dream to get to meet them and work with them. On the left, we have Rick and Shelley Musilowski-Allen. On the right, Davide Salvadore, the maestro. Okay. I got to help Raven Skyriver at his residency in Pilchuck. That's us making a powder pickup of a whale shark pattern. And I even got to work with the famous Marty and Eric DeMaine, although he disguised himself as Spider-Man so that I wouldn't be nervous. Just kidding. This is actually a blindfold glassblowing demonstration, and which is probably one of the craziest things I've ever done. We've not done it again yet, but we will soon. All of these experiences, plus being in a really nice studio, gave me the ability to realize some ideas I'd had swimming around in my head for quite some time. And it was really satisfying and wonderful to get to see these pieces become real. Okay. I also saw some of the most beautiful flowers I had ever seen before when I was living in Florida, and I really couldn't help but try to recreate and capture some of that beauty. I've never been good at watering flowers, my mom will tell you. So this is a flower you don't have to water. I find that wherever I go, my environment is kind of reflected in my artwork without meaning to be. But so when I moved back to the New England area in 2020, I spent a lot of time in my mom's garden looking at her flowers, and lo and behold, a wall of poppies emerged. I wanted to tell you a little bit about how my work is made. You're probably wondering how all those images get onto the glass. The short version is that I make kind of a basic shape of the final form that I'm making, and then I actually put it away in an oven and let it cool down to room temperature. And then I cover the entire thing with a vinyl resist. That's the white stuff on the left that you see. And then I draw my image on there and cut away the negative space. So in this case, the negative space is the kind of pinkish color under the blue. So I'll sandblast off that exterior color, and then I'll remove the vinyl resist. So that one is half removed over there. Okay. So this is the picture of the scrawled cowfish before I picked it up on the right. I also pre-make all the parts. So that the day, so that when we're ready to put the piece together, we can bring it up in an oven, which you cannot see because it's over there. We'll bring it up in an oven overnight. And on the right is the garage. We'll bring up all the parts in the garage, and then when we're ready, we'll light up that one in the middle, which appears to be on the left, and that's where we'll put all these pieces together. Okay. So this is a shot of us at the MIT Glass Lab working on the blue boxfish. I wanted to mention that I cannot make this kind of work by myself. There's some simple things you can make by yourself in glass, but all of us that make really larger and more complicated things rely on other skilled artists to help us make those dreams reality. So on my left is Michelle Trammell, who is also a trustee of the museum, and on my right, Whitney Cornforth. And who you don't see is my partner, Eric Demain, who is both doing doors and taking pictures. Thank you. Yeah, and it's great when we all get together and we're jamming. So that's the final result. Okay. I wanted to mention too that I do spend a long time kind of studying these animals before I make them. I study their anatomy. I spend a lot of time drawing them at all different angles. So this is kind of just a sample of the dirty sketches that I do to be able to make these pieces quickly in glass. Okay. Okay. I started making beavers when I moved to New England. That's been a fun challenge. Okay. I don't know if you guys noticed, right when you walk in the museum, there's this little nook to the left, and that's where the beavers are, if you missed them. Okay. I love artwork that has a narrative, and also the way that these animals kind of, as soon as I give them eyes and a face, they take on this kind of character that I only loosely control. But even more exciting than that is that if you put two characters together, they kind of form a relationship between them, and I really love that. Okay. This last one is actually about one of my own relationships. Thank you guys for coming, and let me know if you have any questions. I'm happy to talk about stuff more in the gallery.
Hi there. Thank you so much for being here this evening, and it's such a thrill to be in this group show with some other artists whose work I'm a huge fan of, so this is a really fun evening. Just let me know if I need to speak up. So this is me. I've been working in glass professionally since 1996. I went to Alfred University and graduated from art school from there. Next. And shortly after that, I was at the studio at the Corning Museum of Glass, which opened in 1996. And some short years later, I was able to return to the studio and take a workshop with Lino Tagliapietra. And it was almost too much at the time. Like, I really didn't understand what I was seeing. I was kind of fresh out of school and just figuring things out. So that's me looking kind of mystified off to the left there. But it was a tremendous opportunity, of course, and we're so fortunate to have had him in our world. He's semi-retired now. Next. And I started doing some collaborative work with my ex, who I met at the studio at Corning. And between the two of us, we had both worked for the same artist in central Vermont, who did a lot of work with Kane and Marini. If you know those terms, you'll know that it's kind of a mosaic process. And so we together, I want to say, had a little bit of a pioneering career together, trying to create these very complex geometric mosaics out of different components of glass. We did that for a while together. We were collaboratively working together until about 2008. And at that point, our relationship did break up. And unfortunately, that means that the work was not being made anymore. Next. But this is how we conceived to make these mosaic patterns. So these were individual pieces of glass that were fused together on a kiln shelf and then rolled up onto a blowpipe to create the final blown vessel form. Next. So that was the flat version, and this is it after going through its process in the glassblowing studio. So we really did have a pretty amazing time together. We were doing work that was definitely, I don't like to use the word groundbreaking, but it was definitely an expansion on Kane and Marini techniques that we hadn't seen other people doing. So 2008, next. Yeah. And I don't know if you guys remember that 2008 was kind of a tough year financially as well. You know, there was the the housing market like crash and everything. It was such a mess. So I was like, you know what, I need to just, my creative sort of focus and relationship had dissolved, and I needed to have a job. And so I got in touch with a friend of mine who I knew through mutual friends. She lived in Providence, Rhode Island, and just kind of said, you know, hey, I'm gonna be moving. I'm thinking about Providence. What do you think? And she was like, yes. I don't know if there's any jobs here, but come out and visit and we'll talk. And you know, we went through one thing or another. And that artist was Tutsinski, who was here just a little while ago, but she had to run. She's always kind of a moving target. So I was able to work for Toots. She offered me a job once I got to town and talked to her for a while. She said, well, you know, I have an assistant who's going to grad school in a year. So why don't you come in and we'll fit you into the role, and then she'll go off to grad school, and you know, you'll be all set to carry on. And that's what we did. And her assistant, who went to grad school, is now the curator at the Harvard Museum where the glass flowers are. She's the head of collections for the glass flowers. So that was pretty cool. Next. While I was working for Toots, I had the good fortune to be working in glass in a creative field under a very established and tremendous artist. And I learned a lot from her about being, kind of living your life as an artist and how to approach your work in a way that really I had not before. My work became much more personal, and I started to make designs on glass elephants. So these are glass elephants by other artists, and the gentleman on the right is Dick Marcus. This is his work on the left. And I was a big fan of just the beautiful, simple lines with this juicy color and these very evocative forms that were simple, like drawings. You know, they weren't trying to emulate an actual physical animal. Next. And this was the wallpaper for my bedroom when I was a child. And so I think between, you know, my life's journey and just kind of falling in love with these illustrative qualities of childhood drawings and cartoons and just illustrations in general, it all came out. Next. And this was the first elephant I ever made when I returned to the glassblowing studio after a pretty good hiatus. About 6 years went by where the only time I got into the glassblowing studio was to make Christmas presents for my family. And so I had a good opportunity. I was like, okay, I'm gonna try these elephants. I, you know, made this little guy who's just so cute, you know, like a little child's drawing. I can never probably make that again because now I have, my skills are too refined, like trying to draw badly. Next. And so I started to incorporate the work that I had been making previously with my new vision for these glass animals. And so there's that same mosaic process. All the colored elements were made in the hot shop. They got cold in the annealer, and the next day I could take them out and then take them into my cold shop and start to cut them up. Next. And there's the final form. So I was just kind of combining these elephants with these multicolored bases, and my idea was that I was making little microcosms, that I was making little worlds that they could live on, and it would be beautiful, and they would be safe, and I could feel that I helped somehow, because sometimes in the face of a lot of uncertainty and environmental troubles, the helplessness you feel really can take a huge toll on you, and so this was my art therapy in, you know, creating a world where I felt like I was keeping nature safe. Next. However, glass is a fickle medium, and I started to have a lot of problems with incompatibility in my various coloring processes. And because I had the good fortune to work for Tutsinski, I had this idea, and I was like, I'm gonna propose a residency to the Corning Museum of Glass, and I'm gonna melt the glass that Toots uses for her work in the glass blowing furnaces. And you can go next. And so I was granted the residency, and this was at the studio at the Corning Museum of Glass. And what we ended up doing was melting a glass that's called Effitre or Moretti or 104. It's most commonly used in the flame working studio to make beads in the United States. People don't use it a lot for glass blowing here. There's a few, but it's rare. Flame working is generally where you would find it, and in Italy it's far more common, but here in the States, not as common. Next. And so that's the format that it comes in. It comes in these big old rods of colored glass. And so as part of my residency, I had access to this color, and then in the furnace, we had clear glass. So I could add this color to the clear glass to figure out how to make my work from that. Isn't it beautiful? This is what I would look at into the studio and what, how I got the inspiration. I was like, I just want to use this to make my work. Next. And so this is some of the work that started to come out of that residency. I was doing a lot of experimentations with the colors next to each other because they're pretty fussy. You can only get away with certain colors next to each other. Sometimes they react and it gets this real muddy surface. So I was figuring all that out. And if I did get muddiness, I figured out how to use it to my advantage. So there was a lot of fun exploration into that residency. Next. Oh, and we melted some color. So on top of the clear glass that was in the furnaces, I was also able to get a little bit of molten colored glass in this mini melter so that I could make some more complicated marinis. And on the right there, that was my first attempt at an egg, a hard-boiled egg, slice. Next. And so this is some of the work that came out of that residency. I did manage to get a few mosaics done, but not very many because they're so labor intensive. I didn't really have the time to explore them thoroughly, but I got to play with these juicy colors and just get an idea of what this particular facet of glass medium was able to do. Next. More work from the residency. Next. And because of my participation at Corning in that residency, I was selected to be a demonstrating artist at the Glass Art Society conference in Venice in 2018. And so that was obviously, for me, a tremendous honor to be asked to be in Venice and actually working in a glassblowing studio. So I did a demonstration, next, at the Effitre factory on Murano. And so that's the warehouse on the right, on the left, and that's me working on the right, and it was the only time I got to sort of throw around my limited Italian is because I knew all the names of the colors in Italian, because that's how we referred to them at Toots' studio. So that was truly a legacy moment for me. It was really great, and I had a wonderful time at the conference, and I just can't wait to go back. Next. And so then I did go back. I took a class in 2019 with the cup maestro. So when I say cups, I mean goblets. The goblet maestro Davide Fuin. And I was with friends at that class. We were all just able to sort of live on Murano for like 10 days and pretend that it was home, just like, oh, now we're locals, right? Because we get to be here for a while. And I learned his techniques, which were incredibly daunting and really humbling. He is 100% the last of his kind in the world, and his art is endangered because there's no market to make really fine Venetian stemware except for museums. People don't generally buy them for their homes. So he's endeavoring to really seed the glass world with his knowledge while he's still young and fit and able to teach workshops. So I was very fortunate to get to do that. I can't say I made very good strides. I was still a pretty crummy goblet maker, but I got to study under the maestro, and that was very special. And next. And then we're getting into 2020, and everything changed. So I was still living in Providence in 2020, but I had designs on moving to Corning. I was sort of in the works. And since I had a lot of time on my hands, I started drawing more. And I have cats and a dog, so I would draw them. Sleeping, there was just nothing else to do. Next. And I started beading. The piece on the left is a peyote stitch glass beaded snake that the peyote stitch takes forever. If any of you are knitters, it's kind of the same idea. It's very methodical. If you mess up, you have to go back and undo it and start again. So it'll keep, when you have lots of hours on your hands, it's a great middle of the winter activity. And then the piece on the right, I moved to Corning in the fall of 2020, and right away, even though we were masked up and not able to be in the glassblowing studio, working regularly, this piece came across my desk, which was to make a commemorative glass sculpture that was, it was commemorating the end of the Kuwait-Iraq War. And it was the 30th year anniversary of the end of that war. And so we worked remotely with the Kuwaiti artists, 2 artists in Kuwait, 2 artists in the United States, to create this piece. Myself and the other glass artist in the States made all the components. We shipped them to Kuwait, and then the artists on the other end finished the pieces with their techniques, which was some lamp working and beading, and made these little oil slick pieces on the bottom. And it's the plant represents this desert plant that's really hard to kill. It's very resilient, and it's a native species in the Middle East. And so that was called Seeds of Peace, and I was very proud to be a part of that project. Next. I still have never seen it in person, fully finished. As my work started to evolve, obviously I was having fun making the little sort of circusy African animals, but I was kind of feeling like I needed some more inspiration and ideas out there. So I was looking at some folk arts. On the right is an outsider artist whose name I'm gonna forget, but really incredible work. You can see it was a screenshot. And then on the left is Evelyn Ackerman, who was a fiber artist, very famous kind of mid-century stuff. Now when you would find her work on eBay or something, it costs a fortune. But I really liked her funky, silly imagery that was just very, that illustrative style that I like so much. And next. And so I started making these little vignettes of animals interacting with each other. And I think a lot of what I think about with these is that I don't really know who to root for. And it's just like watching a nature documentary. It was oh, the baby gazelle, no, the lions are gonna get it. But then if the lions don't eat, then the lions don't survive. And so you never really, there's all that push and pull of nature is not a cute, friendly place. But in my world, I can make it a little bit cuter and friendlier. Next. In 2021, I was selected to be a contestant on Blown Away. We had a lot of time on our hands again, just moved to Corning, but work was sort of slow. And so I was well, I have time. I'll apply for Blown Away, why not? And it was a really exciting experience, and I didn't win. So, season 3 on Netflix, if you're interested in seeing all the excitement. Next. This is the work that you'll see in the gallery. I included these slides. I just wanted to introduce new characters. The tiger has kind of a little bit of a artsy-fartsy significance to me. I had a very particular dream one time, and there was a tiger and butterflies, and it really stuck with me over the years. And so I was I gotta get the tiger made and start to sort of see how that's looking. So we introduced tigers and these incredible, I love this mosaic piece in particular. It really is one of the best I've ever made. Next. And the forest scene. And these are just evocative, trying to create a little environment that these animals can live in, and it's a little bit more contemplative. The tiger's not interacting with anything but itself, its own thoughts, and it's kind of a serene place to be, which is like forest bathing. I think that's a thing that the Japanese have a word for it, when you go to the forest and you just soak it all in. Next. This piece in particular, I feel is one of the best elephant pieces I've ever made. I am phasing out the elephants little by little as my work is progressing. You know, I feel like I've really done them justice and made them a lot, but this piece I was just so happy with the way this came out. Next. These forest scenes are very much a backyard look at life. Again, who do you root for? You know, the foxes, the birds. If you have chickens, maybe you really hate foxes because they can be really destructive. So and of course the little skunk. He's innocent. The skunk's fine. Next. And to close things out, I wanted to show you a glimpse into some new work that I've been approaching. These are cast glass pieces that are a little bit more about my interior landscape, a little bit less about what's out there, and a little bit more about what's going on inside me. And so I have this silhouette series that I'm starting, and here's the casting in progress. It's in a show in Corning at the moment. I applied with the drawing, made the piece. Next. And there was the final piece. So this is the next phase of my work. I look forward to being able to show you this new part of me next time and talk more about that. And in the meantime, I just want to say thanks again for being here and for your attention and for everybody for having us and putting on such a lovely exhibition. So next. That's me.
Hey, everybody. So this is my studio in Lowell. Those are my two children a few years ago. That's where I spend most of my time, besides being at home, and that's kind of my life, you know, studio and home. Who do I look to change the slide?
And also Trina's.
This is a little video. So this is where I grew up. This is a place called the Narrows. I grew up kayaking through there, boating through there, where a lot of water moves. And I used to collect clam shells there, mussel shells, wampum shells, and at low tide, that water dropped significantly. Next, please. There's an aerial photo of that area. And so these are things that inspire my work, and this inspired a series. Next slide, please. So this is a color scheme that I thought of thinking about that particular area. The colors are based off of shells and then current lines. This was a cormorant sitting in the water trying to capture that line and movement. Next, please. So this is more of the Strong Current series. Next slide. This piece is in the show, I really loved that purples and that narrative through that, so I made a few pieces in this. Next slide. Same body of water, Essex Bay, that whole area. I love where the marshes and the water meet in the sky. Next slide. This shows sort of sandbars, aerial views of the sand, the water, and what's underneath it. These are all things that sort of inspire my work. Next slide. This is process. This is, again, a video, but I think we'll see it in still. So that piece there, that was covered in kind of a sand color that I then carve away using a lathe. So that's like a grawl. I have a piece in the show like this that I then bring that back up to temperature and make it into the final bird. Next slide. That's a picture of the little cold shop that I have that's literally right next to a glory hole. So that's a lathe that you use carving. There's a flat wheel for grinding, and then another, like a belt grinder. Next slide. So this was the first piece that I did based off of sort of that aerial view of sandbars and current lines. This was done with sandblasting. I don't care for the process as much, where I moved towards the lathe work where I can get more texture, but you're in a very small booth kind of blasting at glass, and I didn't care for it, so I kind of moved towards another process. Next slide. More inspiration. There's a lot of inspiration photos here. Keep going, please. Larger, that whole piece. Next slide. More current lines, that's forest currents. Next slide, please. More pieces that aren't in the show, but this is sort of showing that coastline and working with cane to get lots of details in the glass. Next slide. And then when you think about, how to put pieces together, here's another inspiration for that. I was looking through my phone and, there's the kids in front of birds, pretending they're birds. I thought it was perfect. Next slide. And there you are, the relationship between two things. Next slide. I really love tuna tails. They're better on fish, but here's something that surrounds us around here. Next slide. Next slide. So this is pretty old work, but I wanted to show it. I've always loved the shadows that glass casts. We're playing with light with glass, so this is all clear, but that clear still casts a beautiful shadow back on a wall, and the glass almost disappears, so it's part of the piece. So always look at the shadows. Next slide. Yeah, next few of these. Yep, next slide. Next slide. This was a very early bird, just based off of birds on piers. This is probably 15 years ago. I've been making birds for a long time. They've evolved over the years. Next slide. Cormorants on the side of stones. I've decided to mount a lot of my work on stone bases, and that's just come from staring at birds in nature. Next slide. Rusty metals, just beautiful. Next slide. I like to try to spend as much time on the boat as I can. That's my little boat, again on the Essex Bay, and my oldest son. Next slide. The little guy, I haven't made a seaweed piece yet, but it's in the works. Next slide. Hundreds of cormorant just sitting there in the water in the fall. Next slide. That's the backside of Cranes Beach. Sunsets, they're finding their way into the work as well. Next slide. My lovely wife, and then beautiful sky color. Next slide. So Cape Ann, I'm from Cape Ann. So the light has always been special, as here in Cape Cod, but I just love the way that reflected on the stones. Then again, thinking about how to mount these pieces, I'm using cut stone, cut granite from the area. Next slide. That's just a pile of granite in my backyard. My studio, the whole front of the studio is filled with granite. They haven't asked me to move it for some reason. The only one with a pile of stuff in front of my studio, but I think I'm grandfathered in, so to speak. Next slide. So I grew up on the marsh. These are the marshes where I grew up, aerial view. And that sort of bird's eye view has always, it's found a way into my work, which you guys can see when you look at it, I hope. And I made a series of pieces based off of the marsh. And there's two in the show here that's sort of the third generation of that color scheme. I feel like I keep improving on it in some sort of way. Next slide. More marshes. Next slide, please. So that was one that was a generation past, essentially. So these are big, bold lines of color using just pure colored canes. And this piece was sandblasted before I had a lathe and really knew how to do lathe working. And I'm still really proud of that piece, but I've moved on to using the lathe and getting more complex with a cane. Next slide. So these are like the canes that I used in this last piece, where each cane has a core of green and then maybe about 5 to 10 different colored canes on there that I pull and stretch, cut up again. And then I'll roll that up onto a piece, and that's how I get that base color that I then carve through. Next slide, please. So that's rolling up that cane on a pre-colored bubble. So that cane's on the surface. There's current lines put on there, kind of the ocean colors, and then sand you can see on the tip of that bubble, and that represents the sandbars that are around there. Next slide. Next slide, that's it melted into the surface. So it's a lot of color work. And then the bird starts to take form, stretching it out, playing with the form, lots of torching. Next slide. These are all little videos that don't quite play. So this year I got kind of away from the birds a little bit and went into a scrimshaw series. kind of went heavily down that like whaling hole essentially. And so these are all carved on the lathe. So layers of colors, usually cups that I make, then stuff other colors into, lots of prep work, and then you start carving. So these were some of the first ones that I did, and I have a whole shelf of them that I'm gonna carve this summer. Next slide. You can roll through these. These are just more details of these pieces. That's Cold Passage, thinking about the story behind the piece. So like picturing you're in a boat going through icebergs on both sides of you. This is Wampum Isles. So based off of that wampum color scheme, and this is supposed to be charts and islands. That's my vision for it. So I'm not trying to say, okay, here's just a tooth, here's a story behind it. Next slide. That one's based off of charts with your lines and your islands, Blue Isles. Next slide. There's some next to some scrimshaw. Next slide. And then again, that's carved on the lathe. These are wheels, diamond wheels on the lathe. So one's a rough wheel, one's a little softer, and you go through lots of steps to get to the desired surface. Next slide. Ear protection is always very important when you're working with a lathe. Next slide, please. Some scrimshaw. There's a few of these. That's in Nantucket. That's where those other pieces are now. Next slide. So I was at the Whaling Museum there, and I saw a pile of rope. I was searching for inspiration. Here's one. Next slide. And that turned into cane. That looks like rope. And I started using this. Next slide. So there's a cup that I made out of that cane. Next slide. That's the piece. That's a video. That's what I made out of that. It's a scrimshaw. I stuffed amber glass into that to get that kind of old rope feel. Next slide. Little small test. Again, with that rope, this will then be carved. I'll carve through that top area and resurface it and open up some of that amber below, just speaking to those ropes. Next slide. And then the most current work that I'm doing, I'm still making the birds. I've been obsessed with those for a long time. They're not going anywhere. But I started making these sky pieces that are in the show. And so, staring at the sky, I'm seeing it in a whole new way. Next slide. This is working on one of those pieces that's in the show, in the studio. So flattening it, kind of eyeing it up. Greg, who's here, is puffing it out. Next slide. And then it's carving. So the picture here is of the pieces. They're totally covered in white. And there's one that I've carved. And then all those scribbles, they look pretty cool. But that is I need to go ahead and surface it with another grit. So just to kind of make sure that I hit everything. Next slide. So I'm working on a piece right now where it's an encalmo piece where you join multiple bubbles together or glass together, where you can get the surface of the water in the sky. So I'm going to combine those sort of techniques between the scrimshaw and these sky pieces to create something like this. Next slide. Recent pictures out on the water. Next slide. This is pretty much it. That's all she wrote. So I have a slip here with my boat. I live in Salem, Mass now. So I've been out on the water close to every day, which has been really important and inspirational.
Cool. So just to clarify, I have many names. So you can call me Trina, you can call me Caterina, you can call me Trina Caterina, like she did. Honestly, if it ends with an A, I'll probably answer to it, so that's cool. Next, please. So the first series I'm going to talk about, you guys probably saw it out in the gallery, the Display Things series. It's a series of playful glass sculptures that you probably want to play with, but definitely should not play with because they're made of glass. Next, please. Oh. So this one is Party of Five. This one's out in the gallery, and it's composed of 5 of these little monsters that I call fragile finger monsters. Next, please. So these are fragile finger monsters. I don't know if you guys remember these toys from when you were kids. I used to get them at the grocery store on the way out, begging for a quarter or 50 cents. They're probably like $1 now. Or at the end of getting a cleaning at the dentist when you're a kid and you can pick one of the toys from the box, this was always the toy that I picked. So when I came across them again as adults, I saw them and knew that they just had to be made out of glass. Next, please. So when making these pieces, they seem really simple, but they're not. This was my COVID project. I think I spent every single day of 2020, once shutdown happened, obsessing about getting these just right and super perfect and exactly to scale and as close to the original as I could get it, including matching all the colors, which can be really difficult in glass. Next, please. And they're super fun to make. I mean, if this is what's looking back at me when I'm glass blowing, it makes me giggle every time, so it's a good day. Next, please. Making the hands, the mold making part of the process is also pretty fun. It can be a little bit grueling and a little bit messy. My husband over there is laughing because the studio turns into a total mess when we're mold making because we're a flame working studio. But I'm super lucky to have some friends and studio assistants that are willing to literally lend a hand and help me with the mold making part. And some of the hands are my hands as well. This is Alex, and that's Tessa, and me in the middle. Next, please. I actually made everyone hold their hand out like this to see who had the biggest hand so I can fit the most monsters on, and Alex won. So the next up in the series that I'm going to talk about is the bunnies. I have just one bunny out there waiting. So with the bunny series, I wanted to, they're inspired from children's book illustrations. I didn't want to tell an entire story, but maybe just one little portion or a little sentence or a word from the story, but not tell the whole story. And these are all flame-worked glass with sometimes blown glass elements. Here, in this case, we have fused glass pieces. Next, please. Here you can see a little bit of the process where I have all the different elements. Each one is hollow, and they're all assembled at the torch. Next. What's fun about making the bunnies is that I can really get outside that really super tedious work where I'm making the mice or the monsters. I can really push my limits in terms of scale and blast the torches as big as they can go and see how much glass I can handle, which is super fun for me. Next. So the mice are the opposite end of the spectrum, where they're super small and detailed, and I try and get as much detail as I possibly can into them. The mice started, people always ask me why mice. They started because I had them as a pet when I was a kid, and I loved them so much. And when I was an adult and started sculpting them, my husband and I went and got some pet mice that we loved so much, and I realized really quickly, I already knew they were amazing, but they were even more amazing than I remember them being. They're super social, really sweet and gentle and loving. So I wanted to celebrate that in these pieces. Next. So when making the mice, I approach it just like I did the monsters, trying to get them as detailed and precise as I possibly can. But also I didn't want to make them as detailed as even I could, because then things start to get muddy. So I find a way to simplify the lines when it comes to the small things like the little feet. They do even have little toenails too. Next. To make the small details, I use a really tiny little torch. It's called a Smith torch. I call it the baby torch. And I use a jeweler's magnifying glasses so I can see what I'm making. If I can't see what I'm making, then I certainly can't make it. Without those, I don't think I could do any of that. Next, please. And that's all I have for you guys today. If you want to connect with me, find me on Instagram. Thank you.
I'm Jen Violette. I'm pretty psyched to be part of this show. Thank you, Mary, for putting together such a great group of artist friends. I'm pretty excited about it. I started working with glass when I was 18. I went to Alfred University. These are some of my early pieces that I made at Alfred. Actually, these are part of my BFA show that I had. I graduated Alfred in 1994. I called this series The Clown Bottles. And I was fortunate to be a student of Lino Tagliapietra and Dante Marioni. And the series, that was during my junior year, 1993, that I was at Alfred. I was a student there, I was at Pilchuck. And anyway, I started making these sort of Venetian-inspired whimsical forms. Some of them are painted with fire on enamels. Other ones are sandblasted, and then I rubbed oil paint into them, like the yellow one or the pink one in the back with the stripes. So I still have a few of these in my studio kicking around that, it's kind of fun. I kept a few. Next. And here, similar to Claire's slide, I kind of laughed when I saw yours. This was me in 1993 with Lino and looking kind of, like Claire did, kind of mesmerized. I had been blowing glass like about a year and a half, and I took Lino's class at Pilchuck, so it was a lot of information to process, and it was super hot. You can see all the sweat lines on Lino there, but it was an awesome class. I learned so much, and it was co-taught by Dante Marioni. Next. Here's a more recent picture from last summer when Lino was at Shantz Gallery in Stockbridge, Massachusetts for a show. That's one of his Florencia pieces there in the front. He's been a great mentor for me over the years, and it's been nice to stay in touch. I've studied with him in 3 different classes, and I've also helped him in different demos over the years. So. Next. And there's an image with Dante. I helped him. He was one of my first mentors, too. I helped him at a collector weekend for Shantz Galleries. He was doing a demonstration with Preston Singletary, and so it was kind of fun to work with him again. He was one of my first mentors. I was like a special exchange student during my junior year at Alfred University, and he came in as a guest artist to teach at RISD in Providence, and I was able to go there for the RISD winter session for 6 weeks, and I was very new to glassblowing. I think I'd only been doing it for maybe a year, and Dante was 28 years old. I didn't even know who Dante was at the time, but my teacher was like Fred Sheeta at Alfred, and he was like, "Oh, you got to go take this class," and I'm like, "Okay, well, if you can get me in." And anyway, so it was pretty fabulous that I was able to study with him very early on, and I got a lot of really great skill. And it was from there that he invited me to be at the Pilchuck class with him and Lino later that summer. So it really was a pretty awesome foundation for my hand skill and stuff. Next. And these are some of the pieces kind of inspired by taking some of the classes with Lino and Dante. These are little, like, very small bottles. They're only probably, the one in the front is probably about maybe 4 inches tall. The tallest one's probably about 6 or 7. And these were little in Calmo. I would do like a little cane pickup, and then my friend was actually melting blue in his furnace at the time. And so I would do a little cane pickup on the open-ended cane bubble. I would put a little lip wrap, and then I would drop a blob of blue glass on the end, and it's sort of like the poor man's in Calmo that, I don't know, other glass people might know, but it's kind of a tricky process. But anyway, it was a fun little practice making these pieces. Next. And this was I tried to make the tiniest little cane bowl I could make in one of Lino's classes at Haystack Mountain School of Crafts up in Maine. And this is literally like 1.5 inches in diameter, and I made it at the furnace. So it's kind of like a miracle that it all worked out, and I put a little lip wrap on, but pulled the little canes were like very, very, very small. Probably about 1.5 inches long each. And then I did this tiny little pickup, and everyone else is making big stuff, and I'm like, I'm gonna see how small I can go, It was kind of funny, but next. And then this is sort of fast forward, I guess, to probably 1999 to 2000. I started making a production line of, and so these are some of my early production pieces, and again, inspired by Dante Marioni's use of bright colors. And I always wanted to put lip wraps on everything, so that kind of became a thing. I called these the curly cones. So I started doing a bunch of opaque series like this. These are all about 4 inches tall. Next. They look so huge up on the screen. These are little cube vases, again, inspired by some of Dante's use of color and stuff. And these I blew into a little wooden mold. These are probably only about 3 inches tall each, 3 to 4 inches. Yeah, just experimenting with different shapes and stuff. And these I ended up exhibiting at the American Craft Council shows. I used to do some of the wholesale and retail shows that would happen in Baltimore every February. So it's kind of how I got, started selling some of my work to galleries and stuff. Next. And then I started doing, I took a workshop. This is Pino Signoretto. I was very lucky to take his workshop at Corning. at the studio at Corning. I think that was in 1999. And so it was great to kind of learn a more sculptural approach. You know, I was always kind of interested in sculpture, but he's just such a maestro. It's pretty amazing to work with him. So I learned a ton during his class. This is a giant horse head that he made that was like basically, you know, actually had a whole body that went with it. And I believe it's in Murano somewhere. I haven't seen the whole thing in person, but pretty amazing. Next. I also was very fortunate to study with William Morris at Pilchuck. That was in 2003. I was a scholarship student at Pilchuck, and the class was co-taught with, it was William Morris, Karen Willenbrink Johnson, and Randy Walker. It was fabulous. So I learned a ton about using glass powders and colors for my own work, and just lots of different stuff about sculpting. It was amazing experience and life-changing. Next. And there's Karen Willenbrink Johnson, which I studied with her again at Corning like a few years back, but she's a good friend of mine, and we really have a blast together. Next. And Ed Branson, who just had a show here. This was at Snow Farm, probably 5 or 6 years ago. I was his teaching assistant. We have a lot of fun. I've apprenticed with him and worked for him it was kind of over the course of 10 years on and off, but he's a really good friend of mine and sort of taught me a lot about the business of selling glass early on. So next. These were some of the first animal pieces I made. I mean, I had made a few animals in college as well, but these were sort of like trying to refine. And I started with rabbits and carrots. When I was a kid, I was in 4-H, and my family, we had a whole bunch of different breeds of rabbits that we raised as pets, and then we'd show them at 4-H fairs, but I really got to learn the rabbit form quite well. And anyway, so this was just a clear rabbit that I made and sandblasted it. I started making this shortly after I took the Pilchuck class with William Morris and stuff, and then also getting inspired by I do a lot of gardening and stuff, so I was making the carrot, and then my studio is in an old barn, so this actually was old wood from our old barn that, and this piece was part of an animal exhibit at the Society of Arts and Crafts in Boston. It was another animal exhibit. So next. And this is another rabbit piece I made. Those two pieces were in the same exhibit, and this was made right around 2004, I believe. This is a rabbit pull toy. So for this exhibit, I decided to make kind of a new version of this piece. So you'll see it in the show. But I just love this little rabbit. But this one sold at that show back in the Society of Arts and Crafts in Boston. Next. This is a watering can that I made when I was a student in William Morris's class at Pilchuck. And it was really the first time this is actually fairly large, I mean, almost life-size watering can, and it was really a great challenge, and really, it was the first time I really started using powdered glass to get the color that I wanted and more of the detail, and it got, it was a really great experiment trying to work with these colors and stuff. Next. These were some of the first vegetable wall sculptures I made. These were just on painted wood, and the vegetables are all furnace-worked glass. I started making a few of the early vegetables when I was at Pilchuck, but then I started adding color to these. Next. And this was a pretty early piece I started making with some of my first ferns and some of the first carrots and a little gardening tool at the top that I had made when I was a student at Pilchuck as well. And I mounted these all in black, and I do woodworking too, so I built all my wood boxes and stuff. Next. This was my garden from, I don't know, probably almost 20 years ago now. It's hard to believe, but we moved to Vermont right around that time, and so I really, it's a beautiful old farmhouse with like 3 acres, so I basically put in all these gardens and just really got a lot of inspiration from the land and from the different plants and stuff, and grew a lot of vegetables and lots of different flowers and a lot of experimenting. And now I have a whole different garden, but that'll be in another slide. But it was a lot of work, but also brought me a lot of inspiration and enjoyment. Next. And these are some of the radishes I grew that, directly inspire me. Next. And this is one of the pieces that's in the show here. I started working, these are all furnace-worked vegetables. They're all pretty small scale, but then I started using stainless steel in the background of my pieces. So I was almost making like a stainless steel canvas for these pieces. And so I started this whole series. And so, next. And then I started making like these fruit still life pieces. So anyway, this is a 5-apple piece. I believe it was 12 by 26 is the overall outer dimensions. This is more of a detail of it. But then I also was using mahogany for the shelf, sort of looking at old paintings by Cezanne and sort of getting some inspiration there. And then I was distressing the stainless steel to it's a lot of hand sanding to kind of create like kind of a sketchy sort of background and kind of distressed look. Next. This is a 3-pair piece. So I had this whole series. And all these fruits are about life size. This piece is 12 by 18. Next. And these are all single fruits. These were all part of an exhibit at the Brattleboro, Vermont Art Museum a few years back. And each one of these is like 7 by 10, so relatively small back panel, but each fruit and vegetable is life size. Next. This is 2 peaches. I sort of liked how they worked as like a little relationship series. Next. And this was an image from the show at the Brattleboro Art Museum, probably 5 or 6 years ago. Here's another image from that exhibit. Next. And here's the Summer Breeze piece that's in the exhibit here. I do all my own woodworking and stuff too, so this is like a big, thick, solid block of mahogany. And then I drill all the holes and then sand all the edges. And then, each hole is actually, believe it or not, like a different size. So I have this sizer thing I make to fit each piece of glass and to figure out which size. They all vary like a 16th or so off of each one. It's kind of ridiculous, but then they're all like epoxied in. So yeah, I just sort of like trying to make grass out of glass. It was kind of fun. Next. This was a show I had at Vetri Gallery in Seattle. I believe this was 2012. So anyway, it was called Crisp, and it was just a really fun sort of compilation of a lot of my wall sculptures. And this was a smaller turf piece here that I called Turf, similar to the piece that's in the exhibit here. Little bell jars I called the Undercover. But I just really liked how they set up my work on the wall. Next. This was a commission for a kitchen home, a kitchen at a beautiful lake home in Minnesota. They had sent me images of their wall space, and then I photoshopped and put some of my work there and gave them a few options, and I really like how it came out, and I love it with the antique like woodworking bench and bowl and stuff. I think it really tied in very nicely. Next. And this was a commission I did for a home in the Boston suburbs. It was through Dane Gallery that used to be in Nantucket. They had gotten the commission for me, but they wanted all root vegetables and, so again, I gave them a lot of different options for that, and it was really a pretty exquisite kitchen, and then my husband and I went and hung them on the wall, which was a really fun project. Next. And then, let's see, I hadn't taken any workshops in a really long time. We had young kids and stuff, and finally I felt like, okay, I can try to get away to Corning for a class, and this was 2016, and this was Martin Janecki, amazing Czech glass sculptor, and in the back is Rasmus Nosbring, another friend of mine. But anyway, he sculpts these amazing blown glass heads that are huge, like larger than life size. And so anyway, I studied with him and really learned a lot about sculpting from inside the bubble, but also how to sculpt glass hands, and that kind of led me into next. Some of the hand sculptures I started making, and then I started incorporating some of my fruits into, so I call this series I call Offering. So it's kind of inspired by my kids picking things in our yard or in the gardens and stuff and like handing them to me, So they're usually just slightly smaller than life-size hands, and they're on steel bases. Next. This is another one. Again, inspired by the garden, but sculpting the hands, I'm starting off with a molten blob of glass. A lot of people are like, are these cast? But no, I'm actually, I gather up glass out of the furnace and I squish it flat, and then I have to cut the thumb, and then I cut all the individual fingers, and then I pull and cut them all to length, and then it's quite a process. Make sure they're all the right length and the right diameter, and then I slowly fuse all the fingers back together. And then I make the bird or the apple ahead of time, have that in a separate kiln, and then I torch a spot in the hand, grab it with a Kevlar glove, and stick it into the hand. So it sort of took a lot of trial and error, but I like how they've evolved over time. And so and the base is steel as well. This one's bird in hand. This one's in the exhibit here. Next. This one I called Love Note. Again, I was just trying to experiment more with hands and stuff and putting the bird on my finger. I've had the chickadees in our yard eating out of my hand like in the last couple years, so it's really pretty awesome with the little bird feet land on your finger. It's kind of an amazing experience. So but this, and like on this piece in particular too, my husband is a metal fabricator and artist as well, and he made the stands for me and gets them to fit so perfectly and gracefully into the wrist, which is a really tricky thing to do and get it so gracefully done. So anyway, he has a little studio right on the opposite side of my studio. My studio's in a big old barn, so he has a little studio there, and it's kind of nice. I can just like bring him the hand, and he makes like a little, he uses copper wire at first to kind of get the shape wrapped around the wrist so it's going to fit, and then he uses that to then translate into steel. So these are all painted steel. Next. And then this was like when I fused two hands together. I had one separate in a little kiln, and then I squished them together. That was really tricky to make, and also to make the left and the right hand and get them about the same size. I don't know, I just eyeballed everything, but it worked out pretty well. I just liked it in front of the glory hole there with the light coming through it. Next. And this is 2017, 2018. I was asked to be a guest artist at the Corning Museum of Glass in the amphitheater there, and I made a big watering can for my demo. And it was part of their 2300. It was like this big event where a lot of people come, and so I was like demoed, and they live streamed it and everything. So anyway, that was a pretty cool. It was kind of fun to scale up a little bit I was working with the team there, which was nice. So next. And here's one of the watering cans, just like how it looks in front of the glory hole. Next. And this is like a piece that I made with the watering can, incorporated with some little seedling pots there, called this one New Growth. Next. And then just some of my inspiration, this little fern. Next. Turned into, this was another, I went back and did another demo in the, actually I went back for a few days in the Corning Amphitheater, and I started this series of ferns. I do have some of the ferns in the show here, and these, I make the long central stem basically, and then all those little separate leaves are little extra little blobs that I have an assistant bring over. I squish them on, cut them off, and then I squish them flat. And each one, I got to eyeball it to get it smaller and smaller and smaller as it goes. It's really like a pretty anal process to build these ferns, and I build them totally straight, and then I give them the curve at the end. But I really love making these. Next. And this is what it looks like before I bend it, so totally straight. So in like each one, it's like, okay, have to kind of like my internal measuring device has to be right on that day. Next. And these are like the ones in the show here. 3 ferns. Next. Oh, and there's a detail. And then this was 2019. I was invited to do a glass blowing demonstration at Public Glass in San Francisco. And there were like 300 people there. It was like with a live band, it was wild. So I decided to do one of my ferns for a demo there, and it went pretty well. And then I did another demo as well of like a giant potted cactus, so next. And I started making some sheep. This was one of the first sheep I made in Corning during the same little residency and I do have some sheep in the show here. Next. This is the piece in the show. We have some neighbors that have sheep, and so anyway, been pretty inspired by sheep in general. This was a really amazing, large prickly pear cactus I saw when I was at the GAS conference in Murano, Italy, and it was pretty inspiring. I wanted to start making some cactus pieces. So next, I started trying to at Corning. I did another demo after I had taught a class there. I believe it was 2018, and anyway, I decided to try a big potted cactus there, and this is some of the Corning team, George Kennard helping me out. And anyway, this is one of the prickly pear cactus parts that I had made up ahead of time, and that's the big flower pot. And George made the flower pot for me because I wanted something really big, and he only knows how to make big, really. So it was perfect, because I always make stuff so small. So anyway, then we assembled it, and it was a pretty fun process. So here I was putting extra parts. Next. And that's what it kind of ended up looking like. That's sort of an aerial view. Next. And that's what it was like the next day. And that was the finished piece. This was a pretty large piece. And then this was I taught a class in Corning, a creative sculpting techniques class in 2018. Next. This is another part of my rabbit series. I call this one Temptation. I have several different Temptation series. Next. It's a little close-up of the rabbit. This is the rabbit that's in the pull toy piece that's in the show here. This was another Temptation one that I made. This is mahogany with the 5 carats, and they all slip down through holes. So you have to assemble it, and then a steel base as well. But next. This is another little Temptation. This piece is pretty small. This is in the show here. I started working on some new, smaller textured rabbits that I was pretty happy with. Sort of simplified rabbit forms. Next. And then just some more inspiration from my garden, pea pods. Next. And then I made some large pea pods, and this one's in the exhibit. Next. And my husband built the stand for it, so it kind of fits and locks right into it. It's kind of, I don't know how he did it. It'd be a tricky thing to build. Next. This big beet is also in the show. And then I was messing around with making some glass mushrooms for a while with glass powdered techniques and stuff. Next. Oh, and then back to some of my apple sculpture, 3 apples. Next. And 3 pears. Next. This was a 3 radish piece. And then these are some of the branches that, just to show a little bit of some of the process, this was a hot sculpted branches that I made. I make all the flowers ahead of time, have those in a separate kiln, then I make the branch, and then I use a torch to sort of, and tweezers to attach each flower to the branch. This is one of the branches that's in the exhibit with the birds. Next. Here I am attaching one of the flowers. And this is the piece that's in the exhibit I call After the Rain. And some other branches that I started making. I take a lot of walks in the woods. We live right near the edge of the Green Mountains in Vermont. And so I find a lot of inspiration of just branches laying in the snow, or as the snow melts down different layers, there's different branches started emerging that had fallen, in all the different storms, and we get a lot of snow there. So anyway, these are kind of inspired by that. Next. And then I started mounting them on the wall, and I have a version of this in the exhibit here. I call these From the Forest Floor. Next. And this was from Sofa, Chicago. I exhibited there with Bender Gallery a few years back, and so some of the pieces all came together pretty nicely for that. Next. A few other pieces from that exhibit. This was a bottle sculpture too. I started doing some bottle still lifes to kind of tie in with the fruits, and it was the bottles were inspired by Morandi, some of his paintings. Next. And then Lino was exhibiting at SOFA also, so he came by to visit, which was pretty cool. He was exhibiting with Chance Galleries like across the aisle, so that was pretty nice. Next. And then I started making this series of landscape sculptures. And this one was, I started making one of the first larger ones at the Corning Museum. That ended up being this piece. I textured the whole surface with glass powders, and then I incorporated some bronze barns into the top surface. I wanted to do a larger one, and so I figured I'd have them help me with something larger scale. This one was about 11 inches in diameter. Not huge, but for me, it's pretty large. This was a smaller one, probably about 6 inches in diameter, again with the bronze barns. So I make all the barns out of wood first on the previous one there, and then I'm making waxes and then having them cast in bronze. The houses are sand cast glass, houses and barns, but these are kind of like reminiscent of my farm in Vermont. And this is like a mahogany base, again with sand cast houses. The landscape is really important to me. This is more of a oceanscape, seaside dwelling, I call this one, with a bronze boat and sand cast glass. And then I used bird's eye maple for the shoreline because it reminded me of sand, and then I paint the surface. And then this is the more recent series of landscape pieces that I'm working on, these little summer houses. I started doing these in 2020, right when the pandemic was starting to shut everything down and everyone was stuck in their homes. I wanted to create like these little perfect worlds that you could sort of, escape to, and so that was sort of my idea behind these pieces. And most recently, I started incorporating tiny little bronze barns into some of these pieces. And the little bronze barn, you can take it off, and there's like a little foundation indent in there. And I started cutting doors in them, and it's pretty cool if they're lit just right because they have this glow from kind of inside through the little doorway. And I started using some patinas on the bronze and stuff. Next. And then this actually is a piece that was in, 2 years ago, I was in an exhibit here called Influential Women in Glass that Mary Childs curated. And the Sandwich Museum actually purchased this piece, and it's in one of the cases in the museum. This one I called Awakening. And around the same time, I started making these little potted plants too, kind of during the pandemic, little things to bring people joy. And so yeah. And this is, I call Raised Bed. This is in the exhibit here. And this is my garden now. This picture was from last year. And those were sunflowers a few years ago. My son had gotten me mammoth sunflower seeds, and so it was kind of cool to see how tall they got. This was just a few days ago. We have California poppies. I kind of let them take over, and this is our place in Vermont in the fall. But the hills are really very inspiring. My studio is in this barn here. It's a big old barn, dates back to 1890. And I did do open studios for a while. I was part of the Vermont Open Studio tours, but I haven't done one in a few years. Next. This was inside. I sort of set that up like a gallery for an open studio. It's much messier than this right now. And then I also paint as well, and so this is one of my landscape paintings that's also in the exhibit here, Big Red Barn. And this is my family, my 2 boys, and that's a few years ago in a lupin field in Maine, but they've grown a lot. One of them's taller than me now, Benny and Nico, so and that's the end.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can we give all our artists a big round of applause and a big thanks? I'm Ed Colopy. I'm one of the trustees here at the Sandwich Historic Society and Sandwich Glass Museum. And it's a pleasure to have you all with us this evening. Thank you for joining us for our artist talk and our opening evening of our new exhibit, where we're carrying on the tradition that started here in Sandwich 200 years ago And we believe as trustees and the staff of the museum that carrying on that tradition of glassmaking is important. And I think our 5 artists that are with us tonight are just helping us continue on with that mission. I've been on the board for about 1 year now, and it has been a year of transition, and it's been quite interesting for me. First, we have a new director of the Sandwich Glass Museum, Mary Childs. Mary, welcome. Mary's been an important part of the museum for a number of years, but we're all excited to have her on board with us as well. And we have many exhibits, exciting new exhibits. We just ended one, just beginning one, and Mary and the team are planning several others and more to come. We've strategically looked to expand some of the offerings and some of the programs of the museum, including the return of docents and people who will help to engage with our visitors, and a commitment to ongoing programming just like this. We've also started something new called the Glass Experience, where our glass blower will get with a visitor or 2 visitors and go through a glass making experience right here in our furnace, in our glassmaking area where we do the demonstrations. So it's been very popular with visitors, and it's just a great way to get a new experience. And thanks to Mary for really putting that all together. We're also strengthening our partnerships with other organizations here in town, which has been something that as a resident of Sandwich, I am really thrilled to see the Sandwich Glass Museum involved with people like the Glasstown Cultural District, the Chamber of Commerce, and with the Sandwich Arts Alliance. So all important partnerships to carry the museum forward. We also have a more engaged board. Many of my other fellow trustees are with us tonight, so right after this, you'll have a chance not only to mingle with the artists, but mingle with some of us as well. But we're all trying to add our own particular time, talent, and treasure to the museum, and really working to strengthen it in a number of ways. So with that, we've also established a fundraising campaign called Stoke the Fires. And its main mission is to take full advantage of a recent grant that we received that we're forever thankful for from the Massachusetts Cultural Commission, who provided us with a grant that then has a matching fund component to it. And that grant is really going to help and has already started to help us with some necessary maintenance and building improvements so that this building and the legacy of Sandwich glassmaking can continue here in town. So with that matching grant does require matches, and I would encourage everybody here this evening and all your friends and relatives to consider making a donation to the museum. And as part of that, you can do that online or certainly see one of the trustees or one of the staff members to help you make that possible, and to help really create the new experiences that we have planned for the museum as well. So with that, a big thank you for coming tonight. The artists will be here in the gallery. There are still refreshments available, and I would invite all of you to join us one more time to say thanks to the artists.